He was a prisoner, surrounded by 37 armed pirates in the middle of the Mediterranean. They named their ransom, and he laughed. Not from fear, not from madness. He told them the price was an insult, that he was worth far more. Then he promised them, calmly and repeatedly, that when he was free, he would come back and crucify every single one of them. They laughed at him. He was not laughing. This is the story of Julius Caesar, and it only gets stranger from here. The city of Rome, at the opening of the 1st century before the Common Era, carried itself with the quiet confidence of a place that believed the world began and ended within its hills. And yet, for all its grandeur, it was a city that had not quite finished becoming itself. Streets coiled and climbed without reason or plan, following the bones of the land rather than the ambitions of architects. The Forum, when morning light fell across its columns and carved stone faces, could feel like the center of civilization. But step a few paces from that gilded stage, and the city dissolved into noise, crowds, and the low hum of private anxieties. Debts unpaid, rivals circling, elections approaching like storms on the horizon. It was into this restless, beautiful, imperfect city that a child named Gaius Julius Caesar entered the world, sometime in the high summer of the year 100 before the Common Era. The family into which he was born, the Julii, were old Romans in the truest sense, and in a society that treated its past like sacred ground, that alone carried enormous weight. The Julii belonged to the patrician class, those ancient families who, by tradition, had stood at the very founding of the Republic. But they carried something even more extraordinary than history. They claimed descent from the Trojan hero Aeneas, and through him, from Venus herself, goddess of love and beauty. Such a story might seem like the invention of a poet, yet in Rome it was taken seriously, spoken with reverence, and folded into the identity of every child born into that line. For all that divine ancestry, however, the Julii had drifted somewhat from the summit of Roman power. There were families richer, families with fresher victories and longer lists of political clients. Caesar's father, who bore the same name, had reached the office of praetor, a dignified position, one that placed the family firmly within the senatorial world. But it was not the kind of position that guaranteed the highest offices would simply arrive in good time, as they did for Rome's most dominant clans. The family stood well, but not at the very peak. His mother, Aurelia, was something altogether remarkable. Ancient writers, who rarely paused to describe women with warmth, speak of her with genuine admiration. She was sharp, composed, demanding in the way that Roman tradition admired. A woman who understood that raising a son in this world meant teaching him not just letters, but posture, judgment, and the art of being heard. In the culture of Rome, where mothers arranged marriages, guided households, and quietly shaped the earliest chapters of political careers, a woman like Aurelia was not merely a background figure. She was a force. One suspects that Caesar learned early, watching her, that authority and composure were not opposites, that the most powerful voice in a room was often the calmest one. Within this already remarkable household, one figure cast a shadow longer than most. Caesar's Aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, perhaps the most consequential general of that era. Marius had done something the Roman aristocracy considered almost miraculous and deeply unsettling in equal measure. He had risen to the highest offices without the benefit of a distinguished lineage, carried there instead by battlefield brilliance and the devotion of ordinary citizens. He had reshaped the Roman army itself, opening its ranks to men without property, binding legions to their commanders through shared hardship and shared ambition. His campaigns against foreign enemies had made him a legend. And in the house where young Caesar sat and listened at the edge of adult conversation, this legend was not a distant public figure. It was family. The stories of Marius were told around the hearth like inheritance. For a boy of intelligence and imagination, the lesson was unmistakable. A man of will could travel further than his birth had mapped out for him. Yet the world that Marius had helped shape was growing more dangerous by the year. Roman politics was hardening into two opposing camps, and the ground between them was shrinking. On one side stood the optimates, senators who believed power should remain in the hands of the few families who had always held it. On the other stood those who looked toward the popular assemblies, to the wider body of citizens, as the true source of Roman legitimacy. Marius and his allies moved in that second world. Against them stood Lucius Cornelius Sulla, patrician, calculating, and possessed of a very different vision for how the republic should be ordered. To a perceptive young boy, simply watching which names were spoken with warmth and which with silence at the family table would have been a thorough education in the fragility of political fortune. Caesar's father eventually received a provincial command in Asia, along the western shores of what we call Turkey today. The family followed, and for the young Caesar it was a first encounter with the ancient Greek world, a world older than Rome, drenched in philosophy, poetry, and history. The colonnaded streets, the great temples, the cadences of the Greek language in the open air, all of it would have pressed against the familiar edges of everything he knew. For a mind already reaching outward, it was a quiet revelation that Rome, for all its certainty, was one thread in a much older and wider tapestry of human civilization. Then, while Caesar was still in his adolescence, his father died. The moment was startlingly ordinary. Reportedly, the man collapsed while putting on his sandals one morning. In a single domestic instant, the boy became, in the eyes of Roman law, the head of his household. Aurelia assumed even greater responsibility over practical affairs, while her son began to feel the weight of a name that carried grand expectations and needed now to be lived up to. Boys of his class were formed through rigorous study, rhetoric, law, history, the discipline of public speech. Caesar took to it with a natural aptitude that his tutors must have noticed quickly. He absorbed language the way dry ground absorbs rain, and he developed early a feeling for the sentence as an instrument, something that could wound or soothe, depending on how precisely it was shaped. All the while, the republic around him was bleeding. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla escalated beyond the bounds of political contest and into something Rome had never thought it would see: armies marching on the city itself. The very soldiers sworn to defend the republic from foreign enemies now brought war into its own streets. Factions rose and fell. Men who had dined together posted each other's names on lists of death. Purges followed victories. The city lived in a permanent state of held breath. Caesar's position in all of this was defined by blood and marriage. Through his Aunt Julia and the sympathies of his household, he was bound to the side of Marius and his allies. In his later teenage years, he deepened that commitment by marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, a man closely aligned with the popular cause. It was a politically considered match, as marriages of that world always were. But by the accounts that survive, it was also a genuine bond between two people. For Caesar and Cornelia, the future must have seemed like a road they would walk together toward influence and belonging. Then Sulla seized control of Rome, and the world changed overnight. What followed were the proscriptions, a word that, in Sulla's Rome, carried the weight of a death sentence. Lists of enemies were made public. Any man whose name appeared could be killed without legal consequence. His property would be absorbed by the state. Those who sheltered him risked the same fate. It was at its core a system of organized terror dressed in bureaucratic language. Sulla turned his attention to Caesar and issued an order: divorce Cornelia. It was the kind of command that practical men obeyed. Many did, separating from wives and allies under duress, calculating that survival now made loyalty later possible. Caesar refused. That refusal, quiet, absolute, offered in the face of a man who commanded armies and posted death lists, tells us something essential about who Caesar was long before the world knew his name. He chose the person beside him over the power arrayed against him. In a city where almost everyone was finding reasons to bend, he simply did not. Sulla's response was swift and merciless. He stripped Caesar of his priesthood, seized what property could be taken, and added the young man's name to the lists of the hunted. Caesar left Rome quietly, moving through the shadows of the countryside, staying just ahead of the men sent to bring him in. Friends of the family, people who still valued loyalty over self-preservation, interceded on his behalf, working behind closed doors to soften the danger. Eventually, by some accounts, Sulla relented enough to allow a kind of cautious exile. He did so, the story goes, with a grumble that has echoed across centuries, that in this young man there were many Mariuses. The line may have been burnished over time in the retelling, but the instinct behind it feels entirely plausible. Sulla was not a man given to careless observations. Whatever he saw in Caesar, it was enough to trouble him. With Rome closed off and dangerous, Caesar looked toward the one space where a man of good birth could still build something without immediately making himself a target. He went east, to serve in the legions of Asia Minor. The army suited him in ways that perhaps surprised no one who had watched him closely. He was physically brave, clear-minded in the middle of chaos, and he had grown up hearing what a gifted general could become in the architecture of Roman life. In the campaign that brought him to the siege of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, he distinguished himself in a way that mattered deeply, not just to his pride, but to his future. He was awarded the civic crown. The corona civica was woven from simple oak leaves, but it was anything but simple in meaning. It was given to a soldier who had saved the life of a fellow Roman citizen in battle, a specific, demanding standard. Every Roman who saw it knew exactly what it represented, that this man had placed himself between danger and another human life and had not retreated. For a young aristocrat with a name to rebuild and an image to construct, it was both genuine proof of courage and a supremely useful public symbol. Caesar would wear it again in later years with the practiced ease of a man who understood how appearances shaped political reality. But in the moment of its granting, it was something simpler and more honest, evidence that he had stood his ground when it would have been easier not to. His time in the East also brought him to the court of King Nicomedes of Bithynia. The Greek courts of that world operated by a different logic than the Roman Senate. They turned on ceremony, personal favor, the intimate politics of men gathered around a monarch. Caesar studied all of it, provided assistance to Nicomedes on matters of Roman business, and sought influence in return. Later, the gossips of Rome, and Rome's political class was never short of gossips, transformed this visit into material for jokes of a particular cruelty, implying that Caesar had yielded too much to his royal host in ways that Roman sensibility found unbecoming. Whether those insinuations held any truth is impossible to say with certainty. What they reveal with perfect clarity, however, is the relentlessness with which Romans scrutinized each other for any softness, any deviation, any handle that could be used to diminish a rival's standing. Then Sulla died. His elaborate arrangements for locking power into the hands of the Senate could not dissolve the tensions that had made Rome a battleground in the first place. But his passing eased the immediate atmosphere of persecution. Slowly, carefully, men who had scattered began to find their way back. Caesar was among them, older now, tested by real danger and real hardship, and ready to begin the subtler work of translating survival into political momentum. The law courts of Rome were where that work began. Roman citizens did not merely attend trials to see justice administered. They attended because trials were performances, public theater in which careers could be made or broken before an audience of thousands. Caesar stepped into this arena as a prosecutor, targeting men accused of looting the provinces they had been sent to govern. The strategy was elegant in its practicality. Such men had made enemies everywhere, among the communities they had plundered, and sometimes among rivals back in Rome who resented their wealth or influence. By going after them, Caesar could present himself as a defender of the wronged while demonstrating, with each appearance, that he feared no powerful name. His Latin was sharp, controlled, and clear, not flamboyant, but precise in the way that cuts deeper than spectacle. He was not yet the greatest orator in Rome. That distinction belonged to Cicero. But he was becoming someone audiences remembered long after they left their seats. And in a city where public memory was political currency, that mattered enormously. Alongside his growing reputation in the courts, Caesar cultivated another quality that Romans both admired and quietly feared in a man of ambition: generosity. He hosted events, supported allies, extended favors, and spent with an openness that the culture of Roman politics required and rewarded. The trouble was that he spent considerably beyond what his actual resources could sustain. By the time he reached his late 20s, his debts had grown into something that would have alarmed a more cautious man. Caesar appeared largely undisturbed. To compete at the highest level, to be not merely noticed but remembered, not merely capable but commanding, he understood that his skills as a speaker would need to be refined still further. The place for such refinement was well established. Generations of ambitious Romans had sailed east to the island of Rhodes, where rhetoric had been taught as a serious discipline for centuries, and where a teacher named Apollonius Molon had built a reputation as one of the finest instructors of the age. Cicero himself had sat before him. Caesar resolved to do the same. He had every ingredient for a promising future: an ancient name, a military honor worn with confidence, a voice beginning to carry weight in the courts, a determination that had already survived a dictator's death list. The crossing to Rhodes was meant to be a brief pause in a story that was clearly going somewhere remarkable. A few weeks on calm water, a season of study, and then the return to Rome with sharper weapons than he had left with. The Mediterranean, however, had its own plans. The eastern sea lanes in those decades were infested with pirates in a way that Rome had spoken about loudly and addressed only loosely. Civil wars and political crises had consumed the Republic's attention, and the gap between senatorial outrage and actual action had grown wide enough for an entire criminal economy to flourish within it. The men who worked these waters were not the colorful villains of later imagination. They were practical, organized, and experienced, many of them Cilicians from the rugged southern coast of Anatolia, drawn into raiding by the knowledge that it paid far better than anything else the sea had to offer. They took grain ships, plundered coastal villages, and seized wealthy travelers with the efficiency of men who had built a reliable trade out of other people's misfortune. Somewhere near the island known as Pharmacusa, Caesar's ship sailed directly into their reach. The details of the encounter blur at the edges with time, but the essentials hold firm. Faster vessels closed in. Armed men came over the side. In the short and ugly business that followed, the passengers were subdued and sorted by value, as cargo might be inspected on a dock. Caesar, young Roman aristocrat, fell cleanly into the category of someone worth keeping. The ransom negotiation opened in the usual way. 20 talents of silver, an enormous sum, the kind that could hollow out a small community's savings entirely. For the great majority of captives, such a figure would have brought immediate, desperate compliance. Caesar laughed. He told them, by the accounts that survive, that they had grossly underestimated the value of what they were holding. The figure was an insult. He suggested 50 talents instead. The pirates, apparently too astonished to disagree, accepted the revised terms. The moment was extraordinary in ways that defy easy explanation. A prisoner, bound by circumstance to the goodwill of armed men, had just negotiated his own ransom upward. Behind what looked like sheer audacity, however, there was something colder and more deliberate. A man ransomed at 50 talents was a figure of serious consequence. A man ransomed at 20 was merely expensive. Caesar understood the difference between those two things, and he understood it immediately. He was also confident, with the calm certainty of someone who has spent years building networks of obligation and friendship, that the nearby cities of the region would produce the funds. His allies, his credit, and the weight of his family name would carry the cost. The pirates, presented with the prospect of more silver, saw no reason to object. He sent several of his companions ashore, toward Miletus and other friendly ports, to begin gathering the money. That left Caesar on the island in the company of approximately 37 men who made their living through violence and fear. For most prisoners, what followed would have been weeks of quiet misery. For Caesar, it became something stranger and more revealing. He moved through the pirate camp as though he had chosen to be there, eating at their tables, joining their games, participating in their physical exercises with the ease of a man who had simply decided to spend some time by the sea. He did not shrink or defer or perform the expected theater of captivity. When he wished to sleep and the pirates were loud, he told them to be quiet. When they failed to settle, he scolded them with the authority of a man who considered silence his right. And they listened, whether it was the sheer novelty of such a guest, or some quality in his bearing that made defiance feel more trouble than it was worth. The ordinary menace of the situation simply did not take root. He also did something characteristically Roman and characteristically his own. He used the time as an audience. He wrote poems and speeches in captivity, and then read them aloud to the assembled pirates, with full expectation of appreciation. When that appreciation did not come, when they stared blankly or wandered off, he told them, without apparent irony, that they were ignorant and uncultured. This amused them far more than it insulted them. He had become, in the strange theater of that island, something between a hostage and an entertainment, a haughty house guest who delivered lectures after dinner and expected applause for them. There was one thread in his conversation, however, that they consistently failed to take seriously enough. Calmly, repeatedly, and with the tone of a man stating a simple fact, Caesar told them that once he was free, he would return. He would have them arrested, and he would have them crucified. The pirates laughed every time. Romans regarded crucifixion as the ultimate punishment reserved for slaves and the worst class of criminals, and the image of a current captive cheerfully prescribing that fate for his captors struck them as a joke in very poor taste. A good one, perhaps, but a joke nonetheless. Caesar delivered the line each time with the patience of a man who understood that it did not yet matter whether they believed him. The days accumulated. Ancient sources placed the duration of his captivity at around 38 days. Through them, he composed, he read, he played at board games, he exercised, and he continued his cheerful, detailed announcements of future revenge. He also watched. With the quiet attention of someone trained to read advantage in any situation, he noted the rhythms of the camp, where the ships were moored, how the guards rotated, how the treasure was divided, how these men organized their days. None of it, one senses, was wasted. Along the coastline, his companions were doing their urgent work. 50 talents of silver did not come together easily. Cities like Miletus had their own financial pressures and their own accumulated grievances against piracy. But they also understood that a rising Roman nobleman, grateful and indebted, could prove a useful friend in years to come. Caesar's own credit, that Roman aristocratic habit of borrowing against an anticipated future, filled the remaining gaps. The ransom for his own head would become simply one more entry in a ledger of obligations that was already growing long. At last, the ships arrived, riding low in the water with sacks of silver. The pirates counted and weighed with the focused pleasure of men receiving exactly what they had been promised. Caesar was released, and one imagines the parting was almost cordial. A final argument or two, a few crude jokes at the expense of the proud Roman, who had spent 5 weeks as their reluctant guest, and then the ships went their separate ways. The pirates had their treasure. Caesar had his freedom. What they had not fully accounted for was that they had also given him something else. 38 days of intimate knowledge, and a motivation that had not faded by a single degree. He did not rest. He did not continue toward Rhodes and the teachers who had been his original destination. He went directly to the Roman authorities in the province of Asia and demanded ships and soldiers. His argument was pointed and practical. Rome's prestige was being openly mocked by men who raided and ransomed without consequence, and here was a moment, while those men were relaxed and scattered, to strike before it passed. The coastal cities, who had suffered their own losses to piracy and who stood to benefit from whatever treasure might be recovered, needed little convincing. A small fleet was assembled from local vessels and willing crews. Caesar moved fast. He knew the anchorages. He knew the routines. He knew exactly where they would be. When his ships appeared at the island, the pirates were caught entirely unprepared. There were no fortifications, no prepared defenses, only shelters and moored vessels and men who believed the episode was finished. They scrambled, but the momentum was not theirs. Caesar's men boarded their ships, captured their crews, and ran down those who fled toward the interior of the island. The treasure that had so satisfied the pirates only weeks before changed hands again with swift and complete finality. The ransom itself, the 50 talents that had purchased his freedom, came back to him, along with the accumulated plunder of earlier raids. The captured pirates were transported to Pergamon and held while Caesar determined the next step. He went to the local governor, a man named Julius, and pressed him to carry out immediate executions. The governor hesitated. Whether it was concern over legal precedent, anxiety about acting without clearer authority from Rome, or simple institutional reluctance, he delayed. And delayed. Caesar had not forgotten a single word of what he had said on that island. He grew impatient. Then he stopped waiting. He ordered the pirates brought out and crucified along the coast, exactly as he had promised, calmly and repeatedly, while they laughed at him over 38 days. He did make one concession to something that might be called mercy. Before the crosses were raised, he ordered that their throats be cut, sparing them the slow and deliberate agony that crucifixion was specifically designed to inflict. It was a small gesture, but a considered one. In that row of bodies along the coastline, something essential about this man comes into focus. He was not simply performing bravado on that island. Every word had been genuine. He could be generous. He could be warm, even amusing in the right company. But when he believed that punishment was deserved and circumstances permitted its delivery, he acted with a speed and certainty that left no room for doubt. The story traveled quickly, through the port towns, along the trade routes, and eventually back to Rome. Merchants and sailors retold it with the relish that remarkable stories deserve. In the Senate and among the equestrian class, men heard that Gaius Julius Caesar had not merely survived kidnapping, but had organized a private naval expedition, recovered his ransom, and delivered a justice that the official machinery of the province had repeatedly failed to provide. It was precisely the kind of episode that lifted a man above the crowd of other ambitious young aristocrats competing for the same limited space. There were practical rewards as well. The recovered treasure eased, at least partially, the growing weight of his debts. He was still far from wealthy by the standards of Rome's great magnates, but he had demonstrated something more valuable than wealth: the ability to convert catastrophe into opportunity, and to do it without hesitation, without waiting for permission, and without losing either his composure or his sense of humor along the way. The episode carried one further lesson, quieter but no less significant. The fact that a private individual, without official mandate or senatorial authority, could assemble ships, hunt down criminals, and administer punishment while governors dithered and Rome's formal institutions looked on, said something uncomfortable about the republic he intended one day to lead. When Caesar finally continued his journey to Rhodes, he arrived not as a man still trembling from what had nearly befallen him, but as someone who had already transformed the ordeal into legend. He settled into the routines of study beneath Apollonius Molon, days shaped by lectures on structure, rhythm, and the architecture of persuasion, evenings perhaps spent retelling his maritime adventure to fellow students with the dry amusement of a man recounting a story he had already decided to own completely. The island gave him what he had come for, a place to sharpen his voice into something precise and irresistible, to learn how words could be arranged so that a crowd leaning toward doubt might find itself leaning instead toward conviction. But behind all that careful study lay a knowledge that no classroom had given him, that the world did not always behave, and that when it did not, a man with courage, clear thinking, and a willingness to act without hesitation could bend circumstances rather than simply suffer them. Those who encountered him in those sun-warmed courtyards and lecture halls were sitting, without knowing it, beside someone who had already learned the lesson that most men spend entire lifetimes approaching and never quite reaching. Eventually, the pull of Rome became impossible to resist. The city where elections were contested, where reputations were built or destroyed before crowds of thousands, where the real game was played, it waited for him with its familiar mixture of danger and possibility. Caesar turned his gaze back toward Italy and began to move. He returned not as a restless young man still searching for direction, but as someone who had taken the full measure of his own abilities and found them substantial. He had seen how arguments could be built and dismantled, how a single well-placed phrase could ignite a room, how a speaker who truly understood his audience could guide them from suspicion to enthusiasm without their quite noticing the journey. Rome was the only stage on which those skills would mean anything, and he was ready for it. The republic that received him was unsettled in ways both visible and deep. Sulla's arrangements had reinforced the Senate's formal authority, but the pressures that had torn the city apart had not dissolved. They had only gone underground. The urban poor still depended on the generosity of powerful patrons in ways that bred resentment alongside gratitude. Ambitious aristocrats still pressed against the boundaries that tradition placed around their advancement. Communities throughout Italy still nursed grievances that no legislation had fully resolved. Caesar, shaped by family connections and by personal experience of how quickly fortune could reverse, read this landscape with unusual clarity. His early steps back into public life were outwardly modest. He took junior offices, learned the interior workings of the Roman state, and made himself visible to the people who mattered. Among his earliest roles was that of military tribune, a position linked to the legions rather than to the Senate, offering him practical experience in commanding soldiers and managing the unceasing small decisions that military life demanded. For a man whose future would rest so heavily on the devotion of his troops, it was an education that no amount of study could have replaced. At the same time, he began aligning himself with those who wanted to restore the powers that Sulla had stripped from the popular tribunes. It was a considered move, a way of presenting himself as a friend to ordinary citizens without mounting a direct challenge to the entire Sullan settlement. Not a reckless gesture, but a calibrated one. The action of a man who understood that lasting success in Rome required knowing not just what to do, but precisely when to do it. In the year 69 before the Common Era, Caesar was elected quaestor. The office was the traditional first rung on the ladder of Roman public life, carrying financial responsibilities, often in the provinces, and granting automatic entry to the Senate. Caesar was assigned to Hispania, the broad Iberian peninsula that Rome had been slowly folding into its dominion across nearly 2 centuries. Spain was distant from Rome in every sense, fertile valleys giving way to rugged, half-conquered highlands. Roman authority spread unevenly across colonies and allied towns and territories that acknowledged the republic more in name than in practice. The work of a quaestor was not glamorous. Accounts, supply chains, the endless complexity of provincial administration. But it revealed how the empire actually functioned beyond the marble and oratory of the capital. how decisions made in Rome sent ripples outward into real communities living under Roman shadow. From this period comes a story that tells us more about Caesar's interior life than any official record could. Near the southern edge of the peninsula, in the town of Ides, there stood a temple of Hercules containing among its dedications an ancient image of Alexander of Macedon. Caesar stood before it and, by the accounts that survive, was overcome. At roughly the same age, Alexander had already carved his way through Asia, toppling kingdoms and planting his name across a continent. Caesar was balancing provincial ledgers and writing administrative letters. He wept, it was said, and told a companion that he was profoundly dissatisfied with how little he had yet accomplished. Whether the moment unfolded precisely as later writers described it, the truth it captures is unmistakable. Caesar did not measure his progress against other senators. He measured it against the most brilliant conquerors history had ever produced, and found himself, by that particular standard, behind. That hunger never made him careless. The quaestorship passed without scandal or disgrace, and he returned to Rome with his Senate seat earned and his administrative experience gained. But underneath the orderly progress, the restlessness remained, a constant, quiet pressure against every wall. The year also brought grief. His wife Cornelia died, leaving him with their young daughter Julia. Not long after, his aunt Julia followed. Both deaths became public events, as the funerals of prominent Romans always were. Elaborate ceremonies designed not only to mourn, but to remind the living of what the dead had represented. The eulogies delivered on such occasions could shape public memory for a generation. Caesar rose to speak at his aunt's funeral before a large and attentive crowd. He spoke of her marriage to Gaius Marius, and of everything that Marius had meant to Rome. In a Senate that still handled the memory of that turbulent figure with nervous caution, treating his legacy as something half respectable and half dangerous, this was a bold choice. Caesar went further. He permitted images of Marius, removed and all but exiled from public sight during Sulla's ascendancy, to reappear in the funeral procession. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Veterans who had served under Marius, families who had admired him, citizens who remembered what his reforms had meant for ordinary soldiers. All of them saw a young man of the Julian house announcing, without ambiguity, where his loyalties lay and whose memory he intended to honor. At Cornelia's funeral, the tone shifted entirely. He spoke of her with personal warmth and evident sorrow. The speech moved those who heard it, and it accomplished something that pure political theater never quite could. It made visible a man capable of genuine feeling alongside his ambition. In a culture that celebrated the devoted husband and father as an ideal, even when the reality of many Roman lives told a different story, this mattered. The crowd saw not merely a sharp-tongued prosecutor or a calculating senator, but a widower who could speak of love and loss with unaffected sincerity. After a fitting interval, he remarried. His new wife, Pompeia, was connected through family ties to Sulla himself. On the surface, this looked like a diplomatic gesture toward the conservative wing of the aristocracy, a softening, or at least a complication, of his image as a man of the popular cause. In practice, it wove him deeper into the intricate web of Roman kinship and alliance that underpinned every serious political career. He moved easily through the drawing rooms and dinner tables of the elite, navigating conversations that drifted between philosophy, wine, and the quiet business of political arrangement, without ever appearing to be doing anything other than enjoying the evening. In the middle years of the 60s before the Common Era, he stood for the office of aedile and won, specifically the curule aedileship, the higher of the two varieties, carrying with it greater status and considerably greater expectation. The aediles of Rome were responsible for public buildings, the markets, and most consequentially in the eyes of ordinary citizens, the great games and festivals that punctuated the Roman calendar. It was, for a man who understood the deep power of spectacle, and who had never allowed the absence of money to limit his ambitions, a role of extraordinary possibility. Caesar embraced it without hesitation and without restraint. The games he organized were remembered for years afterward. Processions of unusual grandeur wound through the city. Exotic animals appeared in the arena. Food was distributed with a generosity that left people speaking of it long after the crowds had gone home. The Forum was dressed in so many garlands and temporary structures that Romans joked their city had never looked so thoroughly festive. Among the ordinary citizens, those vast numbers who rarely appeared in the accounts of senators and historians, but who filled every public space in Rome, he became immensely and genuinely popular. Among the equestrians and lesser nobles, he confirmed something they had already begun to sense: that this was a man who knew how to win people, not merely impress them. The cost was ruinous. To fund what he was putting on, Caesar borrowed on a scale that alarmed even the creditors who were accustomed to ambitious politicians living beyond their means. He was, in essence, staking his entire financial future on the certainty of his political success, betting that the offices and influence ahead of him would eventually generate returns large enough to cover the debts accumulating behind. It was a gamble that many had attempted before. Few had pushed it quite so far or with quite such composure. By the time the aedileship concluded, his debts were enormous and his reputation had never been higher. He also used the role to advance something that no game's budget could directly purchase. During one set of public ceremonies, he arranged for the trophies and symbols of Marius's great military victories to reappear in public display. Objects that had been quietly removed during Sulla's time, treated almost as though the victories themselves had been something shameful. The reaction was startling in its intensity. Older men who had served under Marius wept openly. Younger citizens raised on the stories of his campaigns cheered with an emotion that surprised even those who had expected some response. Conservative senators frowned and muttered, but they could not condemn it outright. To criticize the memory of a man who had defended Rome from foreign invasion was to risk appearing unpatriotic before the very crowd one needed to survive. Caesar had found a way to honor his family's past in a manner that left his opponents with no comfortable ground on which to stand. 2 years later came a contest that revealed the full reach of his ambition and the full sophistication of his methods. In the year 63, he stood for the office of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome. The position was far more than a religious dignity. Its holder presided over sacred rituals that touched every dimension of Roman public life, and occupied an official residence in the heart of the Forum itself. By every unspoken rule of Roman custom, the office was expected to pass to an older, more settled figure, someone who had accumulated decades of visible service and senatorial respect. Caesar's rivals were exactly such men, experienced and confident, and they regarded his candidacy with the particular disdain that comes from assuming the outcome is already decided. He campaigned with a relentlessness that left no class of voter unattended. To the devout, he spoke of traditional piety and sacred obligation. To the ambitious, he offered the promise of patronage and alignment. His mother Aurelia, by some accounts, organized the canvassing from within their household, receiving long streams of potential supporters with the same focused energy she had always brought to the advancement of her son. Caesar himself told those close to him that he would return home as Pontifex Maximus or not at all, meaning that the debts he had taken on to fund the campaign made any lesser result not merely disappointing but catastrophic. On the day of the vote, he won. The Senate received the news with the particular silence of men who have underestimated someone and are only now beginning to understand it. Caesar took up residence in the official house on the Forum, central, visible, and permanent in the Roman public landscape in a way that no temporary role had previously made him. The victory said something larger than the office itself. This was not simply a gifted entertainer of the people. This was a man who could reach into the oldest and most jealously guarded institutions of Roman society, and pull rank from the hands of those who believed it belonged to them by right. His first year as Pontifex Maximus unfolded against a backdrop of genuine crisis. The failed patrician Lucius Sergius Catilina, Catiline, had constructed a conspiracy to seize power through violence, and when the plot unraveled, the Senate gathered in a state of barely controlled alarm to decide the fate of the conspirators already in custody. Cicero, serving as consul, laid out the evidence with devastating precision and demanded decisive action. Cato the Younger argued with his characteristic ferocity that execution was the only answer, that the Republic, to survive, must defend itself without flinching. The mood in the chamber leaned heavily in that direction. Caesar rose and spoke against it. He acknowledged the danger clearly and without minimizing it. But he warned the Senate that executing Roman citizens without the proper trial processes of the assemblies would set a precedent that could one day be turned against anyone, perhaps against men in that very room. He proposed instead that the conspirators be imprisoned in distant Italian towns, their property confiscated, their threat neutralized without crossing the line that separated emergency justice from tyranny. The speech was measured, patient, and deeply rational. Some heard in it a genuine commitment to the principles of Roman law. Others suspected a more personal calculation, that a man who had himself once been placed on a death list might have specific reasons to resist the idea that the state could kill its citizens without due process. Whatever moved him, the argument was coherent, and the courage required to make it, in that room, in that moment, was real. The Senate voted for execution regardless. The conspirators were strangled in the Tullian prison beneath the Forum. But the memory of Caesar's speech remained, admired by some as an act of principled restraint, viewed by others as dangerous softness. It was one of those moments that people would return to and reinterpret as his story grew larger. The following year brought the praetorship, placing him among Rome's senior magistrates with responsibilities over major legal cases and public order. He carried out the duties with his usual energy and without serious misstep. But the year also delivered a scandal from an entirely different quarter, one that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the extraordinary scrutiny that came with living at the center of Roman public life. Each year, the sacred rites of the Bona Dea, the good goddess, were performed in the home of a senior magistrate, attended exclusively by women. The presence of any man was a religious violation of the most serious kind. In the year 62, the ceremony took place in Caesar's household, hosted by his wife Pompeia. During the rites, a young aristocrat named Publius Clodius reportedly disguised himself as a woman and slipped inside. Whether pursuing a romantic encounter or simply indulging in the kind of reckless audacity that characterized much of his life, he was discovered. The uproar that followed combined religious outrage, political maneuvering, and the particular delight that Roman society took in a scandal touching respectable households. Clodius was prosecuted for sacrilege. Caesar stated, perhaps truthfully, that he had known nothing of the intrusion. The case eventually collapsed through means that were widely regarded as corrupt, and Clodius escaped conviction. But Caesar divorced Pompeia regardless. When asked why, if he believed her innocent, he offered a reply that Rome never forgot. He said simply that his wife must be above suspicion. It was a precise and characteristically unsentimental expression of a truth he had understood for a long time, that those who occupy the center of public life are judged not merely by what they do, but by what the imagination of their enemies can plausibly suggest about them. Soon after the praetorship concluded, Caesar received the governorship of Hispania Ulterior, further Spain. The province was wealthy in resources, imperfectly pacified, and far enough from Rome that a determined governor could accomplish a great deal without constant interference from the Senate. For Caesar, the appointment offered multiple forms of relief simultaneously: an escape from the social wreckage of the Bona Dea affair, a genuine military command, and the possibility of income substantial enough to begin addressing the staggering pile of debt that had accumulated beneath his public success. The problem was that his creditors, aware of exactly how much he owed, moved to block his departure, fearing that once beyond the Italian border, he might simply disappear into the provinces and leave them holding nothing. It was only when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest individuals in the Roman world, stepped forward as guarantor of those debts that Caesar was permitted to leave. It was a significant moment. Crassus had his own ambitions and his own calculations, and his willingness to stake his own credit on Caesar's future success was the first visible sign of an alignment between two men whose combined resources and influence would eventually reshape the Republic entirely. For now, it simply meant that Caesar could sail for Spain with a sense of obligation alongside his relief. In Spain, he wasted no time. He settled long-standing disputes, tightened the loose edges of Roman authority, and led military expeditions against tribal groups that had grown bold during years of administrative inattention. Towns were taken, battles were won, and the accumulated results met the formal standard for Rome's greatest military honor: a triumph. That magnificent procession through the city, in which a victorious general displayed his captives and his spoils before the full assembled population of Rome. A spectacle designed to compress an entire campaign into a single afternoon of overwhelming visual glory. As his command in Spain drew to its close and the road back to Rome opened before him, Caesar found himself caught between two desires that Roman law refused to allow him to hold simultaneously. He needed to keep his troops outside the city's sacred boundary, the Pomerium, in order to preserve his eligibility for a triumph. But he also needed to enter the city in person to stand as a candidate for the consulship, the highest annual office the Republic possessed. The rules were clear and offered no middle ground. He chose the consulship without hesitation. It was, in its quiet way, a perfect expression of how he thought. The triumph was spectacular, a procession of captured enemies and gleaming spoils, the city roaring its approval. But it was finished in an afternoon. The consulship was a key. It opened rooms that could not be reached any other way, and from those rooms, greater commands and greater triumphs could be pursued in time. He crossed the boundary, surrendered his claim to immediate military glory, and entered the contest. Short-term spectacle had lost, as it always did when Caesar waited against strategic depth. By the time he presented himself as a candidate for the consulship of 59, the advantages he had assembled across a lifetime of careful construction were formidable. He carried the name of an ancient family with divine legend woven into its origins. He held the moral authority of the chief priesthood. He had governed a province competently and won battles there. He had earned the genuine affection of Rome's urban masses through years of lavish games and public generosity. His connections reached into the networks of Marius's old supporters, into the conservative world of the Metelli, and into the deep pockets of Crassus. What remained was to bring one more towering figure into his orbit, Gnaeus Pompeius, whom everyone called Pompey, whose campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean had made him the most celebrated military figure of the age, and whose soldiers adored him with the particular devotion that shared hardship creates. Pompey had his own frustrations. The Senate had been dragging its feet on ratifying his eastern settlements and providing the land grants his veterans had been promised. Crassus had his own grievances. His equestrian allies, who had overbid on tax contracts in Asia, faced financial ruin and needed relief that the Senate showed little interest in providing. Two of the most powerful men in the Roman world were being obstructed by the same stubborn institutional reluctance, and neither felt comfortable acting alone against it. Caesar looked at this situation and saw not a problem, but an architecture waiting to be built. Roman politics at that moment resembled nothing so much as a crowded room in which half the guests were arguing openly, and the other half were pretending not to hear. The Senate wished to preserve its dignity and its authority. The equestrian class wanted its investments protected. Veterans wanted the land they had been promised. Ordinary citizens wanted grain, stability, and some evidence that the people governing them had a plan. Over all of it loomed the presence of two immensely powerful men who cordially disliked each other, and who were each too wary of the other to move decisively. Pompey's story was one of almost unbroken military brilliance. He had first made his name in the civil conflicts of an earlier generation, then swept the Mediterranean clear of piracy with a speed that left observers barely able to follow the campaign. He had marched Roman authority deep into Asia, settled kings, founded cities, and returned home to a reception that bordered on the divine. The people loved him. His soldiers would have followed him anywhere. But the Senate admired his victories and feared his influence in roughly equal measure. And that mixture of admiration and wariness had produced years of institutional paralysis around everything he needed ratified. Crassus operated in a different register entirely. Where Pompey had glory, Crassus had money, more of it than almost anyone in Rome. He had built his fortune through property, careful loans, and the kind of business arrangements that consistently transformed other people's emergencies into his own opportunities. During Sulla's time, he had purchased confiscated estates at prices that reflected the seller's desperation rather than the land's value. He ran a private fire brigade with the notable habit of arriving at a burning building and opening negotiations to purchase it before sending the men in. He had commanded troops and played a role in crushing the slave uprising under Spartacus. But his military record never quite shone with the particular brightness that made crowds cheer, and the public contrast with Pompey was a source of lasting irritation. Caesar went to each man separately. He listened more than he spoke. He allowed each to articulate his frustrations, his needs, and his sense of being obstructed by men less capable than himself. Then he made a suggestion that required a certain quality of nerve to deliver, that if the two of them aligned their interests instead of allowing old rivalry to keep them apart, and if they brought him into that alignment, they would form a combination that the Senate could not realistically resist. Pompey brought his veterans, his prestige, and the devotion of soldiers across the Roman world. Crassus brought wealth deep enough to fund almost any political undertaking. Caesar brought his gift for speaking, his access to the popular assemblies, and a talent for converting abstract possibility into concrete action. Together, they would be able to shape elections and legislation in a manner that no individual among them could achieve alone. There was no document, no formal ceremony, no inscription recording the terms. There was simply an understanding between three men who knew exactly what each stood to gain and what each risked if the arrangement collapsed. Caesar would have their support for the consulship. Once in office, he would secure the land grants for Pompey's veterans and the financial relief that Crassus needed for his equestrian allies. In return, they would back his request for a substantial provincial command after his term ended, something large enough in scope to allow him to build a military power base of his own. Later generations would give this private compact the elevated title of the First Triumvirate, making it sound like an institution with officers and written articles. At the time, it was simply three men who had decided that cooperation served them better than competition, and who kept that decision largely to themselves. It worked. Caesar won the consulship. His colleague for the year was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a committed conservative who must have spent much of those 12 months feeling like a man who had arrived at a celebration only to discover that everyone else was attending an entirely different event. The consulship was designed as a shared office, two men of equal authority checking one another's excesses. Caesar treated it as a personal platform. His most pressing obligation was the land legislation for Pompey's veterans. The promise of farms upon discharge was a standard and understood part of Roman military life. It rewarded service, settled loyal colonists across the peninsula, and allowed generals to return home bearing gifts for the men who had fought beside them. The practical difficulty, as always, was that land did not materialize from good intentions. Caesar's proposed law aimed to use public land in Italy and revenues from the eastern campaigns to provide farms for veterans and some of the urban poor. He insisted the terms were measured and reasonable. The Senate, warned into position by its conservative leaders, framed the measure as a populist maneuver designed to purchase loyalty at the expense of established property rights, and moved to obstruct it. When it became clear that the Senate would either block the proposal outright or render it meaningless through amendment, Caesar carried it directly to the popular assembly. As consul, he held that right. In the forum, surrounded by the crowds whose goodwill he had spent years carefully cultivating, he asked the people plainly whether they supported the law. Pompey and Crassus stood beside him in public view and gave their approval without ambiguity. The message to the Senate was equally plain. The three most powerful men in Rome were standing together in the open air, and the people were answering with their voices. The crowd roared its approval. When Bibulus attempted to invoke the ancient tradition of observing unfavorable omens, a recognized method of suspending public business, he was jostled and pushed back by the mass of citizens pressing around him. The law passed in a storm of noise and motion. It was a threshold moment. Caesar had shown in front of the entire city that when the Senate refused to move, he was fully prepared to step around it and go directly to the people. From that afternoon onward, the consulship became a sustained contest between his ambitions and the conservative bloc that opposed them. Bibulus fought back with the tools available to him. He attempted repeatedly to invoke religious authority, declaring days constitutionally invalid for public gatherings. Eventually, in an act of protest that was meant to communicate outrage at Caesar's methods, he withdrew from public life almost entirely, announcing that he would spend the remainder of his term watching the heavens for divine signs. The gesture was intended to signal that sacred procedure was being trampled beyond the point of participation. Instead, it made him appear powerless. Romans with a taste for dry humor began to observe that the year belonged not to Caesar and Bibulus, but to Julius and Caesar, as though one man had somehow absorbed both offices into himself and left his colleague to contemplate the sky alone. Caesar did not pause. He secured the formal ratification of Pompey's eastern settlements, giving legal solidity to the cities and kingdoms that Roman campaigns had brought under influence. He arranged relief for the tax farming companies in Asia whose overbid contracts had placed them in financial distress, a measure that satisfied Crassus and his equestrian network. He required provincial governors to publish detailed financial records before and after their terms, making the machinery of extortion more visible and more difficult to conceal. Some of these measures were genuine administrative improvements. All of them deepened the impression that Caesar stood with those who had been repeatedly frustrated by senatorial obstruction, and against those who had done the obstructing. Marriage in Rome was always partly diplomacy, and Caesar understood the language fluently. He arranged for his daughter Julia, his only child, and by all accounts a woman of genuine warmth, to marry Pompey. The match surprised many observers who had expected Pompey to make a more conventionally strategic union with another powerful family. Julia was considerably younger than her husband, but the ancient sources suggest, with some consistency, that the marriage developed into something genuinely affectionate rather than merely contractual. In that tenderness lay a political significance that would become clear only later. Caesar himself married again, taking Calpurnia, daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, as his wife. Piso would subsequently become consul and a reliable ally. The personal and the political had become, in Caesar's life, almost impossible to separate. As his consulship moved toward its close, he turned to the matter he had always cared about most. A standard post-consular assignment, some modest province, a few legions, a limited time frame, held no interest for him. He wanted something on an altogether different scale. With the support of Pompey and Crassus, and with the assistance of a cooperative tribune named Publius Vatinius, legislation was passed granting him command over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years, with multiple legions funded by the state. Transalpine Gaul, the territory beyond the Alps, was added to his portfolio shortly after. These were not quiet administrative postings. Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy, separated from the peninsula proper by the line of the Rubicon, was strategically vital. Illyricum along the eastern Adriatic coast was periodically volatile, and Transalpine Gaul bordered lands that were restless, ancient, and vast. With those provinces came the possibility of campaigns on a scale that would transform not just Caesar's standing, but the map of the known world. When his consulship ended and he departed for the north, he left behind a senate that seethed with resentment and a popular following that had never been more energized. His enemies catalogued what they regarded as constitutional violations and waited for an opportunity. His allies raised their cups to the arrangement that sent him away with an army and kept the city in the capable, if mutually suspicious, hands of Pompey and Crassus. None of them could see, from where they stood, what the decade ahead would look like. Roman politics in his absence did not grow calmer. Street violence became a feature of ordinary life, with armed gangs loyal to rival figures clashing in the forum and along the roads leading into the city. Pompey remained a dominant presence, functioning as an unofficial guarantor of public order. Crassus maintained his vast web of financial relationships and quiet influence. Caesar, from Gaul, wrote reports and dispatches with a regularity and literary care that kept his name alive in every conversation. The three men had arranged the world among themselves, and for a time the arrangement held. Each in his own sphere, each accumulating what he needed, each watching the others with the particular alertness of men who trust in a shared interest, but not entirely in each other. Then in the mid-50s, the human cement that had held the most important of these relationships together gave way. Julia died in childbirth. Her loss was felt as both a personal grief and a political fracture. Pompey had cared for her with a sincerity that no political calculation could fully explain, and her presence had worked, quietly and continuously, to soften the edges of tension between her father and her husband. Without her, the whispers that ambitious men always circulate around powerful rivals found less resistance. It became easier to suggest and to half-believe that the alliance was merely a temporary convenience rather than a durable arrangement. At the same time, Caesar's achievements in Gaul were beginning to alter the balance of public admiration in ways that Pompey could not have anticipated and could not comfortably ignore. The news arriving from the north, rivers crossed, tribes subdued, forts built, borders extended, stirred the Roman imagination with a freshness that Pompey's earlier triumphs, however magnificent, no longer possessed. Caesar's commentaries, written with a clarity and craft that made military operations feel like literature, circulated through the city and kept the public appetite for his story continuously fed. Pompey had once been the unrivaled idol of the Roman crowd. Now he shared that space with a man who was not even present, and whose absence made the appetite for his next achievement only sharper. Sensing that the architecture of their arrangement needed inspection, the three men agreed to meet in person at the town of Lucca in northern Italy in the year 56. The gathering attracted so many senators, officials, and men of influence that it resembled a government in temporary migration. The signal was unmistakable. These three could still assemble most of what mattered in Roman public life around a single table. At Lucca, the understanding was renewed and expanded. Caesar's command in Gaul would be extended, keeping him in position for another term. Pompey and Crassus would stand jointly for the consulship, and upon completing that office, each would receive a substantial provincial command. Pompey was to take the Spanish provinces, conveniently governable through deputies while he himself remained in Italy. Crassus was to receive Syria, with its wealth, and its proximity to the great eastern power of Parthia. The plan offered each man fresh opportunity and kept them formally aligned. It also, in ways that were perhaps not fully reckoned with, increased the stakes for all three. As each grew more powerful in his own sphere, each became simultaneously more formidable and more threatening to the others. Pompey and Crassus won the joint consulship for the year 55 and used their time in office to extend Caesar's command and secure their own provincial appointments, though not without violence in the streets and bitter resistance in the Senate chamber. For Crassus, Syria beckoned with the promise of riches and, more importantly, of military glory, the one currency he had always lacked in the comparison with Pompey. He departed at the head of a large and confident army, certain that the Parthian Empire would provide him with the spectacular victory that had so far eluded him. The Parthian Empire was not what he had imagined. At the flat, open plains near the Mesopotamian frontier, outside the town of Carrhae, his army encountered a style of warfare for which it had not been prepared. Parthian horse archers kept their distance and maintained a relentless rain of arrows, wearing the legions down without ever closing to the kind of direct combat where Roman discipline and formation could decide the outcome. Heavy cavalry swept in with sudden and crushing force. The wide, featureless landscape offered no terrain to anchor the Roman lines or compress the battlefield into something manageable. The legions, so formidable against the enemies they had been trained to fight, found themselves surrounded and slowly destroyed in open ground. Crassus's son Publius, who had shown genuine promise as a commander, was killed. His head was displayed by the Parthians before the Roman lines to hollow out whatever courage remained. Crassus himself was killed during what had been presented as a parley, a meeting that turned suddenly and fatally violent. Thousands of Roman soldiers were taken prisoner, and the legionary eagles, those sacred standards that embodied the honor and identity of each unit, were captured and carried away to the east. The loss of those emblems struck at something deep in the Roman sense of itself, and the wound would not close for a generation. With Crassus gone, the triangle that had held Roman power in a kind of dynamic tension collapsed into something simpler and far more dangerous. A straight line between two men who had once been allies and were now, by degrees, becoming rivals. The memory of the third partner hung over every communication between them, a ghost at the table of every decision. In Rome, the news from Carrhae fell on the city like a stone into still water. People who had come to regard these three as a near-invincible combination discovered, with a jolt, that one of them could make an error from which no amount of wealth or reputation could retrieve him. The political atmosphere in the city darkened alongside this realization. Street violence between rival gangs had been climbing for years, but now it reached a pitch that the ordinary machinery of Roman government could no longer manage. In the year 52, following the death of Clodius in a brawl on the Appian Way, riots broke out with a ferocity that paralyzed the city. The Senate, faced with disorder it could not contain, took an extraordinary step. It appointed Pompey as sole consul. The decision was both a sign of confidence in him and an admission of desperation. Officially, he was to serve as a stabilizing force and then restore the normal pattern of shared authority. Unofficially, he now stood in a position of dominance within Italy that had no recent precedent, and that brought him closer, by the day, to the senators who had long regarded Caesar's growing power as the Republic's greatest threat. Pompey used his singular authority to pass legislation on public order and electoral conduct. He strengthened his ties to the conservative wing of the Senate by marrying Cornelia, daughter of Metellus Scipio, who would later share the consulship with him. The human connection that had once softened the space between himself and Caesar, Julia, whose warmth had been genuine and whose death had left a gap that politics could not fill, was now replaced by bonds with men who viewed Caesar's armies and ambitions with open alarm. Caesar, meanwhile, remained in Gaul, present through his dispatches, his gifts to allies, and the steady drumbeat of military news that reached Rome, but physically absent from the place where his fate was being discussed and decided. His enemies, gathering ever more closely around figures like Cato and within Pompey's expanding circle, pressed with increasing urgency for his command to be terminated. Let him return to Rome, they argued, as a private citizen, stripped of his legions, stripped of the immunity that active command conferred, and exposed to whatever prosecutions were waiting for him. They understood the calculation perfectly. As long as he remained in the north with loyal troops at his back, he could not easily be compelled to accept their terms. The moment he crossed the boundary without an army, he would be vulnerable in ways that all his political skill might not be enough to overcome. What had begun as a clever arrangement among three ambitious men, each feeding the other's needs while advancing his own, had transformed into something neither its architects nor its opponents had designed. One of the three lay dead on a flat eastern plain, his dream of surpassing the others dissolved along with his legions. One stood at the heart of Rome, newly aligned with the forces of tradition and order, and the third watched from the northern provinces, reading letters, issuing edicts, and counting, with the quiet precision of a man who has always known that the final reckoning would not be settled by votes or speeches. The soldiers who would follow him wherever he chose to go. The first triumvirate, which had seemed to braid the competing currents of Roman power into something unified and controllable, was coming apart at every thread. And the place where that unraveling would find its resolution was not the Senate floor, but a river that marked the edge of Italy, a river called the Rubicon. When Caesar first rode north to take up his command, he entered a world that Romans understood imperfectly and imagined freely. Beyond the line of the Rubicon and the barrier of the Alps lay a vast and varied landscape populated by peoples whom Rome grouped, for convenience, under the single broad label of Gauls. The reality was considerably more complicated. Dozens of tribes with distinct languages, ancient loyalties, and deep mutual grievances occupied a patchwork of forests, river valleys, and fortified hilltops across an enormous territory. Rome already controlled the northern Italian plain up to the mountains and maintained influence along the Mediterranean coastline of southern Gaul, where Greek colonial towns had traded for centuries. But the interior, the deeper Gaul, remained outside the Republic's reach, its politics opaque and its peoples unconquered. For a governor with several seasoned legions and a talent for finding opportunity inside difficulty, it was precisely the kind of frontier where history could be made. The first crisis arrived almost before Caesar had settled into his new role. A people known as the Helvetii, inhabiting the mountain valleys that would one day be called Switzerland, had resolved to abandon their homeland. Their territory, beautiful but cramped and difficult to farm, had grown too small for their numbers. Their leaders had decided that the entire nation would migrate westward in a single vast movement, seeking more generous land near the Atlantic coast. To remove any temptation to turn back, they burned their villages and destroyed their crops behind them, and set out, families, wagons, animals, and weapons, as a human tide moving across the landscape. From inside a Helvetian longhouse, the plan may have seemed reasonable and bold. From the Roman perspective, it was a catastrophe in formation. A mass migration of armed people through allied territory could destabilize every community in its path, disrupt trade, and invite other tribes to move in the vacuum left behind. Caesar saw both the threat and, with his characteristic instinct for turning necessity into advantage, the opportunity. He moved with the speed that would become his defining military signature, racing ahead of the Helvetian columns, constructing earthworks and barriers along the easiest route through the Roman province, blocking that path entirely. When the Helvetii sought alternative roads, he shadowed them, harassed their columns, and waited for the moment to force a decisive engagement. That moment came near a place called Bibracte. The Helvetii were experienced fighters, and they prepared their ground well, drawing their wagons into a defensive perimeter and bracing to resist. Caesar deployed his legions with careful attention to ground and formation, pressing the Gauls from multiple directions with the disciplined, flexible power that Roman training produced. The fighting was hard. At one point, the Romans advanced uphill against a stubborn counterattack, but the formations held, absorbed the pressure, and gradually ground the Helvetian resistance down. When it was over, Caesar pursued the survivors, accepted surrenders with the efficiency of a man who already had the next problem in view, and sent the Helvetii back to their original lands. He had calculated that a repopulate homeland would serve Rome as a useful buffer on the frontier, turning a problem into a strategic asset in a single campaign. The dust from that first engagement had barely settled when the second problem arrived from an entirely different direction. Across the Rhine, a Germanic chieftain named Ariovistus had brought a formidable army into Gaul at the original invitation of certain tribes seeking help against their neighbors. Having arrived, he had shown no inclination to leave. He demanded land, tribute, and hostages, and his growing presence alarmed both the Gauls who had not invited him and the Romans watching from across the provincial boundary. The Senate had once extended him formal recognition as a friend of Rome when such recognition seemed convenient. That courtesy now looked like an embarrassing liability. Caesar summoned him to negotiations, speaking with the authority of a power that claimed the right to arbitrate Gaul's disputes. Ariovistus declined, delayed, and finally made clear that he regarded Gaul as belonging to whoever was strong enough to hold it, a philosophy Caesar understood perfectly and intended to answer in the only language it recognized. When reports reached Caesar that Ariovistus was moving his forces and threatening Roman allies, he called a council of war. Some of his officers were genuinely unnerved. The Germans had a reputation for ferocity, and the unfamiliar style of their warfare unsettled men accustomed to fighting peoples they already knew. Caesar addressed them with the brisk impatience of a commander who regards hesitation as a form of surrender, stating that he would march if necessary with a single legion. Honor and shame, in a Roman officer's chest, were powerful instruments. The legions moved. The battle near the Upper Rhine was fierce and decisive. The Germans fought with the wild energy of men who understood that their families were watching from behind the lines, that there was nowhere comfortable to retreat, and that the Romans coming toward them were not going to stop. They charged with tremendous initial force. But force without discipline eventually meets the wall that Roman training had spent centuries constructing. Caesar shifted reserves to where the pressure was greatest, moved along the line to encourage his officers by name, and gradually converted the collision into a rout. Ariovistus escaped across the Rhine with a handful of survivors. The rest of his army was scattered or destroyed, and the message that went out across Gaul in the aftermath was unmistakable. Rome would not permit a rival power to establish itself in lands it considered within its reach. Second, he began to tell the story of these events himself. His commentaries, written with a clarity and restraint that made military prose feel like literature, were circulated back to Rome with the care of a man who understood that battles won in the field could be lost in the telling, and that the version of events that reached the city first tended to be the version that lasted. Through the long winters, when rain and snow closed the mountain passes and made large campaigns impractical, Caesar dictated. The accounts he produced, later gathered under the title of his commentaries on the Gallic War, were composed with the precision of a military mind and the instincts of a storyteller who understood exactly what he wanted his audience to feel. The work's opening sentence divides Gaul into three parts with a neatness that feels almost architectural, and notes, with the characteristic dry elegance, that one of those parts is inhabited by people whom Romans call Gauls and others call Celts. It was more than geography. It was a literary curtain rising on a performance in which the same man played both the leading role and controlled the narration, soldier and author, actor and chronicler, all at once. The war's next chapter drew him northward, toward the peoples Romans gathered under the collective name of Belgae. Caesar himself called them the bravest of the Gauls, a description that functioned simultaneously as a tribute and a declaration of what was coming. They inhabited a landscape of rivers, marshes, and dense forest in what is now roughly Belgium and the northern reaches of France. And when they understood that Roman presence on their borders would inevitably harden into Roman demands, several of their tribes formed a large coalition to resist it. Caesar moved to meet them with the methodical efficiency that had already become his signature, advancing daily, throwing up fortified camps each evening, feeding his decisions with careful intelligence and the reports of scouts who ranged ahead of the column. One of the major early engagements unfolded near the river Ain, where the Belgae attempted to maneuver the Romans into a disadvantageous position, threatening a bridge that was vital to Caesar's supply line while attacking across ground that favored the defender. He responded with the flexible precision that characterized his best tactical thinking. Trenches dug, small forts thrown up at key points, infantry and cavalry deployed to absorb and redirect the pressure. The fighting stretched long enough to test every part of his command structure. Eventually, the Belgae recognized that the Roman line was not going to break, that their own provisions were thinning, and that continuation served no one's interests. They dispersed. Caesar followed them, tribe by tribe, accepting surrenders where they were offered and storming positions where they were not. Among the most vivid episodes of that northern campaign was the siege of the Aduatuci, who had withdrawn into a stronghold set high on a natural hill and regarded their elevation with the calm confidence of people who have never watched Roman engineers at work. They mocked the soldiers below as the siege ramps and towers began to take shape, a reaction that was entirely understandable and entirely mistaken. The hill was a temporary inconvenience to men who treated all obstacles as engineering problems, and the towers crept steadily closer across the weeks that followed. When the Aduatuci finally saw those great wooden structures rolling toward their walls, they offered to surrender. Then, under cover of darkness, they attempted to break out. The attempt failed. The stronghold fell, and Caesar distributed the survivors as captives among his troops and allies. His own account of that outcome is notably cool, the tone of a man recording an administrative decision rather than a human catastrophe. That distance between the prose and the reality it describes is itself revealing. Not every problem in Gaul yielded to the familiar sequence of march, fortify, and fight. On the Atlantic coastline lived the Veneti, seafarers of considerable skill who controlled the harbors and trade routes of what is now Brittany, and who sailed vessels built high and sturdy for the punishing waters of the open Atlantic. When they defied Roman demands and took Roman envoys prisoner, Caesar found himself facing a challenge for which the standard legionary toolkit was inadequate. He responded by ordering one of his lieutenants, Decimus Brutus, to construct a fleet capable of meeting these sailors on their own element. The naval engagement that followed demonstrated something important about how Caesar waged war. He was not attached to any single method. The Roman crews discovered that the Veneti's leather sails and heavy rigging made their ships resilient but slow to respond. They devised iron hooks mounted on long poles to seize and sever those rigging lines, dropping the enemy sails and leaving the Veneti's proud vessels motionless on the water. Once immobilized, the ships were boarded and the advantage swung entirely to Roman infantry fighting at close quarters. The defeat of the Veneti sent a message along the entire coastline that the newcomers from the south were willing to learn whatever craft the situation required and fight on any ground or water that presented itself. Caesar's gaze was never confined to the territory immediately in front of him. Having driven Ariovistus back across the Rhine, he decided to cross it himself, not for conquest, but for demonstration. His engineers built a timber bridge over the fast-flowing river in a time that astonished observers on both banks. Great piles were driven into the riverbed, beams laid across them, and a structure capable of carrying an army was completed with a speed that felt less like construction and more like a statement about Roman capability. The legions crossed, moved through the territories of nearby Germanic tribes, made their presence unmistakable, and withdrew. The bridge was dismantled behind them. The message required no translation. Rome could cross whenever it wished. For the moment, it chose not to remain. If the Rhine drew his attention eastward, the narrow channel beyond Gaul's northern coast drew it in yet another direction. Across that gray water lay Britain, an island known to the Mediterranean world more through traders' rumors and travelers' tales than through any direct military experience. There were trade connections through Celtic intermediaries, and some Gaulish tribes maintained ties with their island cousins. For Caesar, the crossing offered a confluence of practical and symbolic advantages. It would punish those Britons who had supported his Gaulish opponents, extend the visible reach of Roman power beyond any previous boundary, and provide, in the dispatches he would send home, material of a kind that no previous commander could offer. The first expedition, in the late summer of 55, was humbling in its difficulties. The fleet struggled against wind and tide to approach the coast of Kent. On the beaches above them, British warriors, bodies marked with woad, chariots wheeling along the shoreline, hurled javelins and shouted challenges. The Roman soldiers, contemplating the prospect of jumping into deep water in full armor under a hail of projectiles, hesitated. The moment was broken by a standard-bearer who leaped from the prow and waded toward shore, calling on his comrades to follow the eagle rather than let it be taken. The landing was chaotic, but it succeeded. Caesar established a foothold, won several skirmishes, and extracted hostages from local chieftains. Then storms tore through the anchored fleet, wrecking ships and stranding the expedition. After hasty repairs and a careful retreat, he withdrew to the continent, dissatisfied and already planning to return. The following year he came back with a larger fleet and more cavalry, pushing farther inland, forcing more tribes to acknowledge Roman authority, and observing with his characteristic eye for detail the dense forests, the unfamiliar customs, and the iron currency rings that some communities used in place of conventional coinage. But he made no attempt at permanent conquest. The demands of Gaul, the difficulties of supply across open water, and the relentless pressure of weather and distance made it impractical. What he accomplished was something subtler and in its way more lasting. He carried Britain across the boundary between legend and documented reality. For the citizens of Rome who read his reports with a mixture of pride and fascination, the island that had existed at the edge of imagination was now a place Roman soldiers had walked. Back on the mainland, the accumulated weight of Roman occupation was beginning to tell on the Gaulish peoples in ways that statistics could not measure, but that any observant person could feel. Year after year, Roman camps appeared in their valleys. Roman officers made demands for grain and labor. Roman soldiers moved through their towns and wintered in their territories. Caesar was efficient, organized, and generally respectful of the forms of negotiation and alliance. But he was not gentle, and the presence of foreign legions scattered across a landscape that had never known them produced a resentment that ran deep and quiet, like water finding its way through rock. The most dangerous eruption of that resentment came from a people called the Eburones, led by a chieftain named Ambiorix. Caesar had sent several legions under his lieutenants Sabinus and Cotta to winter among them, and for a time the arrangement appeared stable. Then Ambiorix came to the Roman camp with the bearing of a trusted ally and a carefully constructed story. A great coalition was forming, he said. A vast force was moving to destroy the isolated Roman winter quarters. Out of genuine concern for the soldiers he had come to respect, he urged Sabinus and Cotta to abandon their camp and march to a larger Roman force nearby, where they would be safe. The two commanders debated. Cotta argued with the instinct of a man who had been trained to trust fortification over movement. Roman camps were designed precisely to withstand this kind of pressure, and abandoning one on the word of a local chieftain, however apparently friendly, was a risk that military discipline argued against. Sabinus was less certain, or perhaps more trusting, or perhaps simply more afraid of the army that Ambiorix described. The argument between them did not resolve cleanly. In the end, they chose movement, gathering their men, their baggage, and the camp followers who had accumulated over the winter months, and marching out into the cold in a long, strung-out column. They were marching into a trap that had been waiting for them with extraordinary patience. It was precisely what Ambiorix had intended. Not far beyond the camp, the valley narrowed and the hills closed in from both sides, and the warriors who had been waiting there in silence sprang their trap with devastating effect. Missiles poured down from the high ground. The Roman column, strung out along a twisting path with no room to deploy into proper formation, took catastrophic losses almost immediately. The soldiers managed to form a rough defensive circle, but the situation offered no real escape. Ambiorix worked the aftermath with the patience of a man who understood that time and uncertainty were weapons as useful as iron, alternating attacks with offers of negotiation, wearing down both Roman resistance and Roman judgment. Sabinus eventually moved to parley. He was killed. Cotta died fighting where he stood. The column was destroyed almost entirely, and the news of it spread across Gaul like fire across dry grass. In another winter camp, a legion commanded by Quintus Cicero, brother of the great orator, found itself surrounded by neighboring tribes emboldened by Ambiorix's success. The besiegers built their own earthworks and siege towers, studying and copying Roman methods with an adaptability that Caesar himself would later acknowledge. They pressed the garrison relentlessly, day after day, wearing down its strength and its hope. Desperate messages were written and entrusted to Gaulish allies and Roman scouts willing to slip through enemy lines in the darkness, risking everything to carry word to Caesar. One of those messages got through. His response was immediate. Gathering a relief force from the nearest legions, he marched through bitter weather across difficult roads, moving with the speed that had already become his defining characteristic. Arriving near the besieged camp faster than anyone had calculated possible, he used the arrangement of campfires and the movements of his forces to suggest a larger army than he had brought, luring the besiegers into a poorly judged attack and then counterattacking with the precision of a man who had been planning his moves since the moment the message reached him. The siege broke. The Gauls scattered. Caesar rode into Cicero's battered camp and embraced soldiers who had survived on scraps and gone without sleep for weeks, waiting for a rescue that had arrived at the last possible moment. The retribution that followed was methodical and severe. Caesar turned the full machinery of Roman punitive warfare against the Eburones, the people of Ambiorix. His detachments swept through their lands village by village, burning crops, seizing livestock, leaving nothing that could sustain a population through the coming months. Neighboring tribes were invited to join in the devastation. Ambiorix himself disappeared into the deep forest and was never found, but his people were effectively destroyed as a coherent community. Caesar's own written account of this is characteristically brief, the prose of a man recording an administrative outcome rather than a human catastrophe. What it describes, however, is the erasure of a tribe carried out with the efficiency of a bureaucratic process. And yet, for all the force that Caesar had brought to bear across those years, Gaul was not broken. The revolts continued, smaller in scale, scattered across the map, and somewhere in the central highlands, a figure was emerging who understood, with a clarity that none of his predecessors had possessed, that only a unified and coordinated resistance across all of Gaul had any realistic chance of success. His name was Vercingetorix, a young nobleman of the Arverni people, determined, disciplined, and possessed of a quality that is rarer than courage in a military leader: strategic patience. He had not found his rise easy. His own elders initially turned him away, considering his ideas too radical, his ambitions too dangerous. He gathered followers regardless, seized the leadership of his people by force of will, and began speaking the language that the disparate tribes of Gaul had never yet managed to hear from one of their own, the language of collective purpose. Vercingetorix understood something that many Gaulish leaders before him had not, that matching Rome's legions in open-pitched battle was a path to destruction. Instead, he adopted a strategy that cost his own people dearly in the short term, but aimed to starve the invader out. Settlements and farmland in the path of Roman advance were to be burned before Caesar could use them to feed his army. Only a handful of the strongest, most naturally defensible towns would be kept as centers of resistance. One of those was Avaricum, a prosperous settlement of the Bituriges, surrounded on 3 sides by river and marsh and defended on the 4th by a formidable wall. Vercingetorix argued that it too should be burned, that no settlement was worth the risk of a siege. But the inhabitants pleaded for their home, insisting it could not be taken. He relented against his better judgment, and Caesar arrived before it like a man who recognized both the opportunity and the challenge it offered. The siege that followed was a test of endurance conducted in cold and hunger. Roman engineers constructed massive earthwork terraces and protective shelters against the sorties of the defenders. Gaulish warriors on the walls hurled down stones and insults in equal measure. The legions, short of food and working through weeks of punishing labor, pressed on with the grim determination of men who had decided that suffering was simply part of the task. When the Roman engines finally battered open a breach, the assault went in, and the soldiers who poured through carried with them the accumulated fury of everything they had endured. The town fell, and most of its inhabitants were killed. Caesar records the numbers in his commentaries with a detachment that is itself a kind of violence. For him, the severity was necessary and therefore unremarkable. For those who survived it, and for those who heard of it across Gaul, it became a wound in the memory of a people. Not every engagement in those years went Caesar's way. At the hill town of Gergovia, in the Arvernian heartland, he met a check that dented the aura of invincibility he had spent years constructing. The position was steep and well defended, and a combination of confused orders, difficult terrain, and the dangerous enthusiasm of soldiers who pressed an attack further than they had been authorized to go led to serious disorder. The Gauls, fighting on ground they had known since childhood, counterattacked with devastating effect. Roman cohorts were driven back down the slopes in disarray. Casualties mounted. Caesar was forced to withdraw, a retreat that was both a military setback and a gift to Gaulish morale at a moment when morale mattered enormously. The final confrontation, and the one that history would remember above all others, came at Alesia. After weeks of maneuvering and skirmishing, Vercingetorix led his forces into this fortified hilltop settlement in the territory of the Mandubii, calculating that from a position of natural strength, supplied by allies and sustained by the loyalty of a gathering relief force, he could hold out until the accumulated weight of Gaulish resistance broke the Roman campaign entirely. Caesar, recognizing that allowing such a leader to remain undefeated would keep the entire war alive indefinitely, chose to surround him completely. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering the ancient world had ever witnessed. Caesar's legions built a continuous line of fortifications encircling Alesia, ditches, walls, towers, traps, and obstacles extending across miles of uneven ground. Then, anticipating the arrival of the relief army that Vercingetorix had sent for, they turned around and built a second line facing outward, of equal strength and equal length. The Romans thus sat enclosed between 2 concentric rings of their own construction, besieging the town from within and defending against the approaching relief force from without. Inside the inner ring, Vercingetorix watched his supplies diminish day by day. Outside the outer ring, a vast Gaulish relief army gathered, drawn from tribes across the length of Gaul, the largest coalition that the resistance had yet assembled, come to deliver the blow that would break Rome's grip on their land. For several days, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The relief forces launched assault after assault against the outer Roman line, probing for weaknesses, attacking at night, coordinating with sorties from the garrison within. Roman soldiers ran from sector to sector, reinforcing threatened points, counterattacking where breaches threatened to open, trusting to the solidity of earthworks and to each other. Cavalry under experienced officers threw back charges that had come perilously close to breaking through. There were moments when the Roman lines bent to the edge of what they could absorb. In the end, discipline and the cohesion of veteran soldiers who had been through worse carried the day. The relief army, exhausted by repeated failure and unable to find the decisive breakthrough it needed, broke apart and scattered. Inside the inner ring, Vercingetorix understood that no rescue was coming and that his people faced starvation if the surrender was delayed further. What he did next was remembered not for its military significance, but for its human one. He dressed in his finest armor, rode out from Alesia, circled Caesar's position one last time, dismounted before the Roman commander, and laid his weapons at his feet. The moment carried the weight of an ending. Organized resistance across Gaul effectively collapsed with it. There were still campaigns to be fought, smaller revolts, punitive expeditions, the endless work of consolidation, but the central question had been answered. Roman authority, sustained by the legions and by the will of the man who led them, had been imposed across the entire region. The human cost was staggering. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved in the years of campaigning, and even accounting for the exaggeration that was common to such reports, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Tribes were shattered, lands burned, populations uprooted and dispersed. And yet, in the long passage of time, roads were built and markets established, and the administrative structures of Rome began to take root in the very soil that had been scorched. The people who came after those who had died fighting Caesar would eventually speak Latin, serve in Roman legions, and send their own representatives to sit in the Senate of the city that had once seemed an invader. History has a patience that outlasts every individual caught inside it. For Caesar himself, the rewards of those years were immediate and concrete. He had transformed borderlands into a vast and productive source of revenue and military manpower. His soldiers, veterans of campaigns where his decisions had determined whether they lived or died, men who had built those impossible earthworks and crossed those German bridges and waded ashore on British beaches, were devoted to him in the way that only shared extremity creates. They were not merely his army. They were in the deepest sense his. They had watched him stand in the front lines during moments of crisis, share the cold and the hunger of difficult campaigns, and distribute the spoils of victory with an openness that made every soldier feel seen. They called him simply their general, the word carrying within it a mixture of respect, devotion, and something close to awe that no formal title could quite replicate. Every year he remained in the north, his power deepened. His legions were not merely troops under his command. They were men whose lives had been shaped by his decisions, whose survival had depended on his judgment, and who would, when the moment came, follow him not because Rome required it, but because he had earned it. In Rome, the view of all this was considerably more complicated. Senators read his commentaries with the particular discomfort of men who admire something they also fear. The victories were magnificent, good for Roman prestige, profitable for Roman commerce, satisfying to a city that had always defined its greatness through conquest. But beneath every elegant sentence of those campaign reports lay an uncomfortable reality. One man now commanded a battle-hardened army of ferocious loyalty, far beyond the Senate's direct supervision, and growing more formidable with each passing season. Some called him the defender of the Republic's frontiers. Others said, more quietly, that he was doing in Gaul precisely what he intended one day to do in Italy. The argument never resolved, It simply continued, growing more urgent as the years passed and Caesar's name grew larger. Through those final winters in the north, he sat in his headquarters, writing and reading and exchanging letters with allies and adversaries in the capital, threading his influence through the distance like a hand reaching across a map. The wars in Gaul were, for practical purposes, finished. The next contest would be fought over something less tangible but no less real: the question, ancient and permanent, of who would command Rome itself. When Caesar first laid eyes on Alexandria, he was arriving as a man in pursuit, trailing the loose ends of civil war across the Mediterranean, expecting another round of negotiations and violence. What he found instead was a city that bore almost no resemblance to anything he had known. Alexandria was the vision of Alexander of Macedon made permanent in stone. A city of rational grids and long colonnaded avenues. A harbor designed with the precision of an architect's drawing. A place where philosophers argued in the streets alongside merchants shouting in a tumble of Greek and Egyptian, and sailors from the far edges of the known world moved through it all as though they belonged there. Behind the magnificent public face of the city lay a royal palace where a dynasty of considerable imagination and considerable violence struggled to govern a country that had been ancient when Rome was still a cluster of huts on 7 muddy hills. The ruling house was Macedonian by origin and Egyptian by ambition. Its members favored grand names and tended to reuse them across generations, which had produced a family tree populated almost entirely by variations of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, many of whom had married one another and subsequently attempted to eliminate one another. It was an arrangement that kept the royal bloodline conveniently concentrated and made every family gathering a matter of genuine personal risk. The official ruler at the moment of Caesar's arrival was a boy not yet in his teens, known as Ptolemy, who technically shared the throne with his older sister Cleopatra. The sharing, however, had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. The courtiers surrounding the boy king had moved against her, leveling the kind of accusations that ambitious palace factions invent whenever a more capable rival needs to be removed. She had retreated into the interior of Egypt with a small number of loyal followers, temporarily displaced but by no means finished. Cleopatra was not the figure of delicate, ethereal beauty that later centuries would impose upon her image. The portraits that survive from her own time suggest a face of strong features, a commanding nose, a firm jaw, eyes that seem to register everything in front of them with precise attention. What made her exceptional, by the consistent testimony of ancient writers, was not appearance but presence. She spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian itself, a remarkable distinction in a dynasty that had typically maintained a careful distance from the culture it ruled. She was musically accomplished, swift in conversation, and entirely comfortable operating in whatever register the situation required. She understood, with the intuition of someone who had grown up at the center of a murderous court, that power was not merely a matter of armies and treasury. It was also a matter of being able to hold the complete attention of the person in front of you. The men managing the young king believed they could simplify Caesar's arrival with a single dramatic gesture. They presented him with the severed head of the man he had been pursuing across the Mediterranean and waited for gratitude. Caesar looked at it with an expression that mixed revulsion with cold calculation. His most dangerous opponent was dead. That much was convenient. But men who murdered guests on their own coastline were not the kind of partners who simplified anything. The atmosphere in Alexandria became, from that moment, considerably more tense. Somewhere along the Nile, Cleopatra was watching and calculating. She needed to re-enter the situation before it was decided without her. The palace was controlled by people who had every reason to prevent her from reaching Caesar. The solution she devised, whether wrapped in carpet or bundled in bedding, as the ancient accounts describe it with varying precision, was less about the specific method than about the audacity behind it. She contrived to arrive in Caesar's presence privately, without announcement, having crossed whatever obstacles lay between exile and opportunity through sheer force of determination. He unwrapped the delivery and found not a bundle of laundry, but a young queen who had decided that the best way to change her circumstances was to appear, in person, at the center of events. The impression she made was immediate and lasting. What followed between them was a conversation, and then gradually something more that altered the balance of power in Egypt within days of their first meeting. Cleopatra wanted her throne restored, this time with security sufficient to prevent its being taken again. Caesar wanted Egypt stable and aligned with Rome, a grateful ally at the mouth of the Nile rather than a fractious client state requiring constant management. The practical interests fit together with a neatness that the personal chemistry between them reinforced and complicated in equal measure. She was in her early 20s, he was in his early 50s, at the peak of a fame that Gaul had made continental. Both were accustomed to being the most consequential presence in any room they entered. Alexandria did not grant them the leisure to conduct this partnership in peace. The courtiers surrounding the young king understood precisely what was happening, and understood also that if Caesar sided with Cleopatra, their own influence would dissolve overnight. Tensions accumulated. Small incidents multiplied. The city, which had received Caesar as a visitor, began to turn against him as a participant in its politics. Before long, what had been a diplomatic situation became a military one. Caesar found himself holding a relatively small force, confined to sections of the palace district and the harbor, facing Egyptian troops who knew the city's geography with the intimacy of long familiarity. The fighting that followed, known to later historians as the Alexandrian War, was among the least comfortable campaigns of his career. Egyptian forces worked to cut him off from fresh water, to control the harbor's access points, and to make his position untenable through slow strangulation. He responded with the improvised ingenuity of a commander accustomed to solving problems under pressure, fortifying sections of the city, seizing or destroying ships to prevent their use against him, reading the geography of the harbor for every advantage it offered. At some point during the fighting, fires set to deny the enemy use of vessels in the harbor spread to the nearby dockside buildings. Ancient accounts connect this moment, with varying degrees of certainty, to damage suffered by the Great Library, that legendary repository of accumulated human knowledge. The sources are imprecise about the extent of what was lost. What is clear is that the fighting caused destruction that appalled those who witnessed it, and that the residents of Alexandria, caught between two foreign-backed factions contesting their city, endured the experience of watching their world burn in a quarrel that was not entirely their own. Through all of it, Cleopatra remained close to the center of events. She was not waiting to be installed as a symbol once the outcome was decided. She knew the loyalties of nobles and priests, the fragile alliances that held Egyptian society in its particular shape, the pressures and personalities that Caesar, as a newcomer, could not have understood without her. Her knowledge gave his military presence a political intelligence it would otherwise have lacked. His military presence gave her ambitions a force that Egyptian politics alone could not have supplied. It was a partnership of genuine mutual necessity, animated by something that went beyond calculation. The turning point arrived with reinforcements, fresh troops brought by Caesar's officers from neighboring regions, that broke the logic of the siege. With restored numbers and renewed supplies, he was able to move out of his constricted positions and force a decisive engagement. The battle came near the Nile itself. Egyptian forces, including those loyal to the young king, attempted to hold the line. They could not. In the confusion of the retreat, the boy king's boat capsized as he attempted to flee across the river. His body was found afterward in the water that had sustained his kingdom for thousands of years. With that, resistance in Alexandria ceased. Caesar installed Cleopatra as queen, pairing her formally with a younger brother, another child named Ptolemy. in the manner that Egyptian custom required of its rulers. On the surface, the arrangement honored tradition and satisfied the demands of local ceremonial. Beneath the surface, no one who was paying attention doubted where actual authority resided. For those who wished to understand the situation in its fullest dimension, it was useful to consider that the most powerful general in the Roman world had now positioned himself as the protector, and in a sense that the Egyptians were encouraged to imagine as something deeper than diplomatic, the companion of their queen. The months that followed carried a quality unlike anything else in Caesar's driven, relentless life. He and Cleopatra traveled south along the Nile on a royal barge, a slow, deliberate journey into the interior of Egypt, past a landscape that must have struck a man formed by the hills of Italy and the forests of Gaul as belonging almost to another world entirely. The river in flood season spreads itself across the land with a generosity that has no equivalent in the north. Fields of luminous green stretching away from the banks, ancient villages perched on higher ground above the waterline, and temples rising at intervals along the shore, their walls covered in hieroglyphs that no Roman scholar could read with any certainty, but that radiated the authority of a civilization so old it made Rome feel young. On the royal barge, Greek, Egyptian, and Latin voices moved through one another in conversation and music and the easy flow of days without urgency. For the Egyptian people lining the banks as the procession passed, the sight of their queen visible on the water was familiar and reassuring, a monarch performing the ancient ritual of presence. For Caesar, it was something different. A long, unhurried look at a kingdom whose extraordinary splendor rested on foundations that were quietly giving way, whose independence was drawing to its close even as it still dazzled everyone who encountered it. During this period, Cleopatra became pregnant. In the summer of the year 47 before the Common Era, she gave birth to a son, and the name she gave him left no ambiguity about the paternity she wished the world to understand. The boy was called Caesarion, Little Caesar. In Egyptian ceremonial art, he would appear beside his mother wearing the double crown of a pharaoh, the image of legitimate royal succession. Caesar himself never formally acknowledged the child as his heir under Roman law. That would have required him to announce, in a city that still maintained the fiction of its republican values, that he had produced a son with a foreign queen. A step that even he calculated as too far too soon. But the connection was visible to anyone who chose to look at it, and Cleopatra had every reason to ensure that people looked. A child who combined the ancient blood of a Macedonian dynasty with the name of Rome's most powerful man was not merely a son. He was a statement. Caesar could not remain in Egypt indefinitely. The eastern provinces required attention. Local rulers needed to be reminded of Roman expectations. He left Alexandria with Cleopatra installed securely on the throne, a grateful ally at a vital point on the map, governing a kingdom whose wealth was immense and whose position at the mouth of the Nile made it essential to whoever wished to control the Mediterranean world. She watched him go with the composure of a woman who had learned to read the currents of power across great distances, and who understood that her own security was now woven into the larger tapestry of Roman politics. She ruled from Alexandria with a quality of attention that encompassed both the Nile Valley and the wider world beyond it. She managed internal revolts, balanced the competing interests of Egyptian priests and Greek administrators, and kept a close and careful watch on every report that arrived from Rome. She knew, with the clarity of someone whose survival had always depended on reading situations accurately, that her future was entangled with the fortune of the man who had departed. At some point after Caesar's eastern campaigns concluded, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with her son. She did not seek formal visibility, no processions through the Forum, no appearances before the Senate. Roman sensibility had limits, and she understood them well enough not to press against them directly. Instead, she resided in a villa across the Tiber, in the zone where foreign dignitaries could be accommodated without disturbing the delicate ceremonial boundaries that governed who belonged where in the city's rigid social geography. Her presence was a sensation regardless. Romans were accustomed to visiting kings and foreign embassies, but a reigning queen from Egypt, rumored companion of their most powerful general, arrived with a child whose very name announced his paternity, was something the city had no established category for. Some watched her with fascination, noting the quiet authority of her bearing and the composure with which she moved through a world not her own. Others regarded her as a troubling emblem of foreign influence at the heart of Roman power, an Eastern monarch whose relationship with Caesar suggested that he was developing appetites unsuitable for a man of the Republic. Caesar made the nature of his regard unmistakably clear when he arranged for a statue of Cleopatra to be placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, the shrine associated with his own family's claimed divine ancestor. For the Romans who saw it, the gesture was startling in what it implied. It did not merely honor an ally. It inserted the Queen of Egypt into Caesar's own public mythology, suggesting that he understood their connection as something that belonged in the same story as his ancestry, his identity, and his divine lineage. Conservative observers, already deeply uncomfortable with the accumulation of honors and authority gathering around him, saw in this statue a living symbol of everything they feared. A man who no longer felt bound by the Republic's ancient suspicion of kings and the entanglements that came with them. For Cleopatra, Rome was a revelation of a particular kind. She saw the crowded forum and the quarrelsome Senate, the grand villas standing in proximity to cramped and crumbling tenements, the street violence and political feuds running just beneath the polished surface of the city's self-image. She would have seen, with the eyes of someone accustomed to reading power in its rawest form, how fragile all of it was, how the marble and the ceremony barely contained the anxiety underneath. When Caesar was killed, the shock reached Alexandria like a wave crossing open water. The news would have arrived in a city that immediately understood its implications. Whatever protection Cleopatra had enjoyed as the companion of the dominant figure in Roman life was dissolved in the moment the knives came out on the Senate floor. Her position in Rome became untenable overnight. She left the city and returned to Egypt, where she would soon face the need to build entirely new alliances, this time with men who claimed to carry Caesar's legacy forward and who would need to be assessed, courted, and managed with the same precision she had brought to every relationship that mattered. But that belongs to the next chapter of her story. What matters here is what the encounter between them had set in motion. For Caesar, Egypt had provided wealth, prestige, and a reminder that the world contained ancient powers and ancient ways of organizing human life that Rome had not invented and could not entirely absorb. For Cleopatra, the Roman connection had offered both a shield against her enemies and a lever against the forces that had once pushed her into exile, and a child whose name was itself a kind of political argument, one that would outlast both his parents. Their paths never crossed again in person, but the consequences of what had passed between them would echo forward through the next generation of Mediterranean history, shaping events that neither of them would live to see concluded. By the time Caesar turned his attention back toward Rome, the landscape of Roman politics had hardened into something that no amount of correspondence or negotiation seemed capable of softening. His years in Gaul had made him the most accomplished military commander of his generation. Those same years had made him, in the eyes of a growing number of senators, the most dangerous man alive. They could count legions as well as he could, and they knew what those numbers meant. For a time, the Senate had maintained the comfortable pretense that everything was proceeding normally, that the Constitution remained vigorous, that Caesar's extraordinary power was a temporary and manageable feature of an otherwise healthy republic. Eventually, that pretense became impossible to sustain. The core of the problem was entirely clear to everyone involved and entirely resistant to resolution. Caesar would not surrender his command without guarantees that protected him from the prosecutions that waited for him the moment he became a private citizen. The senators who opposed him wanted precisely that moment, wanted him to cross back into Italy stripped of his army and his immunity, vulnerable to every charge that years of political enemies had been carefully preparing. He demanded that Pompey disarm simultaneously if he was to disarm at all. That suggestion was received in the capital with the contempt of men who had already chosen their side. The letters flew back and forth through that winter of 49. None of them closed the distance between the two positions. Then the Senate, operating under the influence of men who now looked to Pompey as the defender of the established order, issued its demand. Caesar was to dismiss his legions and return to Rome at once, as a private citizen, without condition. He walked his troops to the Rubicon. The river itself was unimpressive, a modest stream threading through the Italian countryside, unremarkable in every physical sense. What it represented was everything. Roman law was absolute on the point. No general was permitted to bring a standing army across that boundary into Italy without the explicit authorization of the Senate. To do so was rebellion, stripped of all euphemism. Caesar understood this with complete clarity. He had understood it for years, which is why the moment carried the weight that it did. Later writers placed a suitably dramatic remark on his lips as he crossed, something about dice cast and fates accepted. Whether those words were actually spoken is impossible to verify. The act itself required no verbal accompaniment. It said everything that needed to be said. Rome received the news in a state of panic that moved through the city with extraordinary speed. Pompey and the senators who had been most vocal in opposing Caesar concluded almost immediately that the city could not be defended with the forces currently at hand. Rather than be trapped and besieged, they withdrew, south first, then across the sea to Greece, where they intended to gather armies large enough to meet Caesar on terms more favorable to their cause. It was a rational calculation that looked, from the outside, very much like flight. Caesar advanced through Italy at a pace that left observers struggling to keep up. Town after town opened its gates, some out of genuine sympathy with the man who had spent years cultivating popular goodwill, some out of the simple arithmetic of self-preservation in the face of an army that showed no signs of slowing. He was careful, deliberately and visibly careful, to treat the communities he passed through with restraint. There were no massacres, no confiscations, no lists of enemies posted for elimination. He promised safety to those who did not resist, and he kept the promise. It was not magnanimity for its own sake. It was a message, composed as carefully as any of his written dispatches, about what kind of Rome he intended to build. The march grew more confident with every mile, and with every unopened gate. The distance between what Caesar was and what the Republic had imagined it could contain grew wider and wider, until the gap between them was simply too large to pretend it had ever been anything other than what it was. He moved with the speed that had become his most reliable weapon. First to Spain, where forces loyal to Pompey were stationed and waiting. He neutralized them before they could cross the sea to reinforce their commander, dismantling that threat with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that unfinished business had a habit of becoming catastrophic. Then he turned east, crossing into Greece to meet Pompey's main army on open ground near a place called Pharsalus. Pompey had the numbers, more soldiers, more senators, the formal legitimacy of the Senate's backing, and the weight of an institution behind him. Caesar had something different. Men who had followed him through the forests of Gaul and the siege works of Alesia, who had crossed German rivers and waded onto British beaches, and who fought with the particular ferocity of soldiers who trust absolutely in the man giving the orders. The battle was close and hard and loud, with the noise of cavalry on the flanks and infantry pressing against infantry in choking dust. Then Caesar's line broke through, and what had been a contest became a rout. Pompey's army dissolved. The great rival fled toward Egypt. where the welcome that awaited him would ensure he never troubled Caesar or anyone else again. What followed across the next several years was a sequence of campaigns that erased, one by one, every remaining pocket of organized resistance. A challenge in Asia was brushed aside with such speed that the brief dispatch Caesar sent to Rome announcing the victory, a mere 3 words in the original Latin, became a proverb for effortless success. Further battles in North Africa and Spain accounted for the remaining opponents who had gathered under the banner of the old senatorial cause. Each year, another cluster of enemies was swept from the board. Each year, the circle of Caesar's authority expanded. By the middle of the decade, somewhere in the mid-40s before the Common Era, there was no serious armed opposition left anywhere in the Roman world. Caesar stood alone at the center of everything. The Republic, which had always maintained a principled allergy to kings, possessed an old and dusty instrument designed for exactly this kind of emergency, the dictatorship. In its original conception, the office was a temporary measure, a mechanism for allowing one man to act with the decisive speed that crisis demanded for a period strictly bounded by law. Caesar had held it before, in shorter iterations. Now the terms extended. He was appointed dictator for consecutive years, and then finally dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. The word was ancient. What the word now meant was entirely new. In practice, it meant that almost every significant decision in the Roman world flowed through a single mind. He presided over the Senate, directed legislation, controlled foreign policy, and shaped the appointment of magistrates who would then govern that policy's implementation. He did not abolish the institutions of the Republic. He preferred something subtler, to sit at their center like the still point inside a turning wheel, allowing the familiar forms to continue their rotation while ensuring that nothing of consequence moved without his knowledge or consent. He was not idle in that position. He enlarged the Senate by bringing in men from Italy and the provinces, a deliberate widening of the pool of those considered eligible for power, reasoning that a broader elite would both strengthen the state and bind more people to his system. Traditionalists muttered about the dilution of the body's dignity. The new members were not complaining. He reformed the calendar, working with astronomers to align it more accurately with the solar year, and the pattern of months and leap days he established would govern the rhythms of European life for many centuries to come. He addressed debts, stabilized the currency, founded colonies where veterans could be settled on land they had earned through years of service, land that would simultaneously anchor Roman influence at the edges of the empire. He extended citizenship and local rights to communities far from Rome, making the identity of being Roman something that could be grown into rather than only born into. The honors accumulated around him with a speed that left some observers uncertain whether to feel impressed or alarmed. A special gilded chair, a laurel wreath, which had the convenient secondary function of concealing the thinning of his hair, a vanity he had never entirely abandoned. The title Pater Patriae, Father of the Country, statues placed in temples alongside the gods, his face on coins, which no living Roman had previously arranged for himself. The word king remained carefully unspoken, but the architecture of daily life in Rome was beginning to resemble a monarchy in all but that single, carefully avoided noun. During a public festival, the tension that had been building beneath the city's surface broke briefly into the open. Mark Antony, loyal, physically imposing, entirely comfortable performing in front of crowds, offered Caesar a crown before a public audience. Caesar declined it. Whether the refusal was sincere or calculated, whether he was genuinely uncomfortable with the symbolism or simply reading the reaction of the crowd, was impossible to determine from the outside. The audience itself was divided, some relieved, some visibly disappointed. The moment passed, but it settled into the memory of every senator who had already been asking himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts, how much further this was going to go. Among those senators were men who had once fought beside Caesar or served under his command, men he had pardoned, promoted, and treated with the careful generosity of someone who understood that gratitude, properly cultivated, was a form of political currency. Gaius Cassius was sharp-minded, experienced in military command, and possessed of a disposition that found the current situation intolerable. Marcus Brutus carried a name weighted with ancestral meaning. His family claimed descent from the man who had, in the old legend of the Republic's founding, driven out the last king of Rome. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after the Civil War, treated him with marked personal respect, and given him positions of genuine responsibility. To watch such a man move, gradually and with evident anguish, from uneasy acceptance toward active conspiracy, is to understand how deeply the fear of what Caesar represented had penetrated even those who had most reason for personal loyalty. The plan that took shape through whispered conversations in private gardens and quiet rooms was specific in its details and precise in its date. Caesar would attend a session of the Senate in March, in a hall that formed part of the complex built by Pompey. The conspirators noted the location's symbolic weight and said nothing about it aloud. They arranged themselves among the attendees, daggers concealed beneath their togas, their number large enough to make the outcome certain if everyone held his nerve. Their motivations were not uniform. Some were driven by genuine conviction that the Republic required rescue, others by personal resentment or ambition that had dressed itself in the language of principle, others still by a fear of what Caesar's continuing consolidation of power would eventually mean for men like themselves. On the morning of the appointed day, the warnings multiplied. Friends urged him to stay home. Family members reported troubling dreams. Notes had apparently been intercepted, omens observed. Caesar moved through all of it with the impatience of a man who had faced real danger too many times to be deflected by atmosphere and anxiety. He could not bring himself to believe that the men he had governed alongside, pardoned, and elevated would actually do this. He entered the Senate chamber, took his seat, and began to receive petitions. What followed has been described so many times across so many centuries that it requires deliberate effort to remember that for the people inside that room, it was not an iconic moment unfolding in slow, inevitable sequence. It was sudden, chaotic, and appalling. A senator approached with a request, seized his toga as though pressing the plea more urgently, and the daggers came out. Blows fell from all directions simultaneously. Caesar attempted briefly to defend himself, and then, by the ancient accounts, saw faces he recognized among those striking him. He drew his toga across his face, as though he wished not to see what was happening or not to be seen, and fell. His body came to rest at the base of a statue of Pompey, the old rival whose shadow had never fully withdrawn from Roman public life, and who seemed, in that final dark irony, to have gotten the last word after all. Outside, the city shook with confusion. Word spread through the streets in fragments and rumors, each one arriving slightly distorted, slightly more alarming than the last. Some Romans believed that liberty had been reclaimed, that the Republic, like a man waking from illness, would now rise and breathe freely again. Others, with longer memories and fewer illusions, feared that the removal of one dominant figure would simply clear the ground for another conflict, more savage than the last. The conspirators, who called themselves liberators, emerged to explain their actions to a city that had recently received from the dead man's hands distributions of grain, relief from debt, and the spectacle of public games. The crowd listened with an ambivalence that made the liberators deeply uncomfortable. In the days that followed, Rome discovered what many had suspected, but few had said plainly: that killing a man at the center of a system does not restore the system that existed before him. It simply leaves the center empty, and empty centers in Rome had a history of filling violently. Caesar's will, when it was read, named a young relative, Gaius Octavius, as his adopted son and primary heir, a designation that immediately transformed a young man of 18 into a figure of enormous political consequence. Mark Antony moved quickly to secure the treasury and the loyalty of the legions. The senatorial elite divided into factions shaped by fear, calculation, relief, and grief in proportions that varied by individual. The Republic, which had endured foreign invasions, slave uprisings, and civil wars, now faced another long convulsion, set in motion by men who genuinely believed they were saving it, and who would discover, in the terrible years ahead, exactly what it was they had actually begun.